Thank you, Sean, for being here today to speak on the effects of quarantine on smoking, vaping, and all substance abuse. Sean is a licensed psychologist with over 30 years experience with psychiatric mental health, dual diagnosis, and crises intervention health problems. And, you know, he's been so great to Maui College in helping us and supporting us and sharing the knowledge that he does know. So Sean will be back talking about change in, I think in a few weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. So thank you, Sean.
You are more than welcome. And thanks everybody for coming in today. And I'm glad to get recorded. I want to just start off with a heartfelt love and prayers to you guys over there. I have been constantly speaking to my friends on Big Island and Maui and Oahu, and having lived there for a long time, I understand just the unbelievable challenges you guys face over in a close community on an island. So I just really, like everybody else, hope this comes to an end as soon as possible and we can start to resume our lives as normal. And that being said, we're planning new Care House is planning for February to come over and do service work. That's the really wonderful Christian group who I get to work with, who invite me to work with them sometimes. So I'm trying to work my schedule out to get over there in February if everything is going as we might hope and the island opens up and we don't get hit with slowdown again. So with that, I just want to preface a couple things before I go through this material and then leave some time at the end for any questions, and then make sure everybody's got like my cell phone number and my email, because I'm open, you know, to work anytime in pro bono. If you guys have any concerns or questions, just yourself, your lives, your family, or anybody who is associated with the University of Hawaii, I'll be happy to be available. So when I put all this material together, I was like, wow, this lecture is not, it's incomplete. And the reason is because new research is coming out all the time. But, you know, I just scan different sites, which I'll go over, where I really feel good research is at. And that's so important today to get the most honest, reliable information that we can get so we can make decisions on that. And like most of us are highly aware of now, not all the information we get is correct. And it's often censored or highly skewed, which is just so irresponsible. And, you know, I'll hit on that a little bit as we get into it. Some places are still in full quarantine. Others are semi-quarantine. Other places in the world are gradually opening up. So we're just going to have to see how this goes. I believe probably as the year closes, at least for drug and alcohol, statistics, we'll be getting those probably February and March is generally when they get out. And we get a lot of census from NIDA, National Institute of Health, the coroner's office, the US Bureau of Census, and stuff like that. So I'll certainly be looking for that and compiling it when it comes in. The complications, and Joyce alluded to this to some degree, after quarantine ends, will continue, and there'll be numerous, and I'll get into those later. On the next lecture, I think is going to be November 9th, and perhaps another one either in December or in January, perhaps. I'm going to deal with mental health, because it was just way too much information to even begin to assimilate and hand out in any type of reasonable way right now. And what I'm going to include is what really impacts younger people today, since I see a fair amount of younger people in the office, and that is, you know, they're already socially distanced, and quarantine has only compounded that. So what we're seeing already is kids that already had troubles with social cues, social skills, team building, communication, language, vocabulary, picking up on nuances and things like that. They're already separated so much because they're just mostly driven by media and internet type communique. And now with quarantine, as I said, it's just been compounded, and they could be really almost regressed depending on how much longer this goes. One other thing, early in my career, I was part of a lot of different research type groups. And I did research on a number of different stuff from, tests, running tests on people, psychometrics, the MMPI, the SASI, and a number of other tests, and also on some drug studies and sleep studies. And what I realized is I hated doing studies and putting together the information, but I love to review research. As a matter of fact, it's one of my favorite things to do, is get in and look at research and assimilate it and kind of make sense of it, and then hand it out to people either in the office or via lectures or stuff like that. And I probably have a couple of books rolling around in my head. I just don't have the time to get them out or something like that. So, and that being said, we have to really look at where we're getting information from. People bring in magazines, and I see stuff online, and I'm like, that doesn't sound right. And then I'll access the University of Michigan or Johns Hopkins or even CDC or whatever, and try to access the study. And I'll find there's a great dispersion between what is being reported in things like Us Magazine, People, Facebook, a number of things. Women's Weekly, a lady brought in some stuff a month ago, and I was like, this is not right. And it may just be a little off, or it could be grossly off. And I very rarely ever see redactions, like the people who do the research coming out and saying, hey, People Magazine, you completely misrepresented this information. So it's important, to look where we're getting information from. And I'll be hitting those places a little bit on the lecture, and you guys are more than welcome to go to these websites, and they're just a source of very good information for you to give out to people that come and see you. So here we go. Here's some American Red Cross for you. We are in what is known as a macro event. And I can't remember if I covered this in April. I think I did a little bit when we talked about the culture of smoking, which is a big part of what I'm going to be talking about again today. But we're in a macro event. And whenever there's a macro event, COVID, quarantine, hurricane, it could be any of a number of disastrous situations, we look at the micro impact. And the micro is us in our individual lives, what we're doing, how we're functioning, where we live. If we're relatively stable and things are going okay, and maybe we have a little bit of money in the bank, or we have supportive or larger families, people can weather macro events relatively well. And the longer they go on, even the highest functioning people will begin to have problems, which is, I'm starting to see some of that now. Some of the really higher functioning people starting to have some problems. But the same hold true for those in the micro who aren't doing too well when a macro event hits. Do they have health problems already? Do they have financial problems? Do they not have enough family or peer or friend or Ohana support? These people are impacted very aggressively and sometimes tragically right at the onset of a macro event, especially if they're in need of care, medical assistance, all of that type of stuff. I've had people in the office in the past month who I need to get into hospitals, and I can't get them into hospitals. I got 4 kids with bipolar disorder who are just off their nuts, literally, and I cannot get them into a hospital. So we're dancing around not being able to do the work we need to do. So these are just some of the impacts that are coming up. So it's important to kind of keep that ideology of how people are functioning and that kind of a system of articulation to get a better understanding of it. So getting on with this COVID-19, I have a couple slides on what we know and what we don't. Pretty much all the research that I've looked at, I think you guys are pretty familiar with this too. First known origins are probably late December, mid-December, to the first week of January is when the United States heard about it. And the country of origin is in China, of course, Wuhan City and Hubei province. Let me see. Joyce, is there a way that you can close this meeting as being recorded?
I can pause it. Would you like me to
Yeah,
pause?
well, the thing is it's up on my screen and I can't see my note here.
Oh,
It's right up
can
on the
you
screen.
just move it? Like use your cursor and move it?
Yeah, it's not letting me do that, actually. Let me exit that. Maybe continue. Okay, there we go. We got it. Okay, so let me start this over here. Okay, so Wuhan, and a couple of terms I'm sure you guys know, but I was hearing some people the other day and they had some of these a little bit mixed up, but it's important when we have this going on to understand what it is. An epidemic is a sudden increase in the amount of a disease, okay? An outbreak is a higher than expected number of occurrences of a disease in a specific location and time. Pandemic means an event in which the disease spreads across several countries and affects a large number of people. And then whenever you see the word acute, it's happens suddenly. And it's also intense is a word that we'd throw in there as well. Currently, from Johns Hopkins, great source of research, Johns Hopkins Hospital, 37 million cases worldwide. I'm sure the World Health, which I have not been very favorable towards after this event, will probably say the same, and so will the CDC. And we're seeing 1 million deaths worldwide. And not great numbers there, but it isn't the Spanish flu, which took out 500 million people at the end of World War I. In the United States, 7.7 cases with 214,000 deaths. And of these, and this was some information that got really blown out on different news channels, is 90% of these cases had comorbidity. And so people were saying are 90 or 94%. And then some stations, mostly kind of conservative base, were like, oh, well, only 6,000 or 6%, sorry, of the 214,000 died actually of COVID. Well, I guess you could look at it that way, but it isn't really accurate. The truth is that these people did have underlying conditions which they were managing or dealing with or getting treated for. Many of them may have survived, but COVID, like any other influenza, any alpha, beta, gamma influenza, would have probably caused them to lose their life. So, and I'm going to add to this, addiction is a pre-existing condition. It is a comorbidity. So if people are addicted to nicotine, if they're addicted to cannabis, alcohol, cocaine, any drug at all, that is considered a coexisting comorbidity and morbidity. And as a result, they are in a much higher risk of dying if they contract COVID. I'll also say that in March, when this kicked in and into April, I was immediately aware of, and so were other people that worked in my field, that next to people with diabetes and COPD, heart disease, forms of cancer, the next biggest group that was, and people that were very aged, 75 to 80 and onwards, the next biggest group that were going to get impacted by this were people with addiction, and especially ones who smoked their drug. That was the number one thing. And one of the things that should have really been done early on was giving huge bellwether information out there to people who smoked and people who were smoking drugs when they went into the smoke shops and everything else, and somehow tried to work on limiting that or getting people not to share apparatuses, smoking devices, bongs, things like that. So it's just important to kind of think about those things in hindsight. And we will learn a lot at the end of this. and the information we compile afterwards is going to be incredibly important to how we deal with this if it happens or when it happens again in the future. COVID-19, SARS, or COVID-CoV-2 appears to not be a mutating virus. And that's what we know, at least so far, one day at a time. So far, it doesn't seem to be that. It is absolutely believed to be either a type A, which is an alpha influenza virus, or a beta influenza virus. That's either animal, human, or from some other source. But this one seems to be zoonotic, and it has a genome, which means its DNA and RNA clearly came 96% from a bat, okay? So, and it could be bat, chicken, bird, swine, horse, camel. Those are the big ones. There's other forms of genomes for viruses. I'm not a virologist, so I can't really go too much into depth, but you can get a wealth of information. Again, CDC, Johns Hopkins, actually WebMD, and I reviewed a lot of the Wikipedia stuff. It isn't disambiguated yet, but a lot of the information is actually, I think, pretty good so far. Just a little bit more on this, what we know. Symptoms, the big ones are a fever. If you're running a fever, and that's why they're checking with planes when they started up and going into concerts and any speaking engagements, they always were looking at fever as number one. Loss of taste, loss of appetite, fatigue, dry cough, shortness of breath. I have a small graph to show you, which I think really sums it up. But one of the big things about this novel virus, this new virus, is that when it hit people, we didn't have any forms of antibodies against it. One thing, and this is really kind of disturbing information, I kind of waited whether or not I would even suggest it, but this virus binds with human DNA at a very, very high percentage, very high, which means, some bird flus, when you get the flu shot, you get 3 or 4 different strains of a predicted type virus that will begin to build antibodies against. When you get a novel virus, we don't have any antibodies. Some people will get it and be asymptomatic. Other people will get it and it will cost them their lives. And we just never know who's who. For myself, when the swine flu came out, I had the flu shot 3 months before. I got the swine flu in 2011. It almost killed me. I was sick for a month. My doctor almost put me in the hospital. And it was really 10 years ago, I realized that you could get so sick from the flu that you could die. And so anyhow, when you get a novel type virus, a new one, our immune systems are expecting something that isn't too serious. So they'll send out some cytokines, which fight it off, ward it off. These are to ward off in an inflammatory way. But when you get a new virus, we get an overdose of those in the system and it becomes toxic to us. And the result of that is a cytokine release syndrome or cytokine storm actually kills tissue in our body and most of our vital organs, and that's been one of the reasons the cause of death in first older folks, but also everybody with pre-existing conditions. And here are a few of the other reasons why this virus has been lethal more than most that we would get. Remember, every year, the flu in and of itself, I think the figures that I saw last were about 280,000 to upwards of 600,000 people a year die of the flu. And so this year we have a flu that hopefully will be the most major flu we get for the next year, because people are going to finally be practicing good hygiene, washing your hands, infection control, stuff that they beat into us working at the hospitals. I mean, I had nurses just screaming at us, wash your hands, wipe down doorknobs, surfaces. Hopefully with this practice in our culture now really up front, hopefully we'll see a reduction. If there's a silver lining in all of this at all, we'll see a reduction in this type of influenza in the future. So anyhow, when the cytokine storm happens, this is where it enters into pneumonia and acute respiratory failure. And that's simply the lungs are just too weak to pump enough oxygen into your body or remove the carbon dioxide that's coming that we need to get out. We breathe in fresh oxygen and we exhale carbon dioxide. We have oxygenated blood, which is red, and the deoxygenated blood, which is carbon dioxide, gets exhaled every time. It's really an amazing system. When you really look at the respiratory system and how it works, it's just brilliant. And yet it is defenseless against stuff like this, the way we're set up. And again, acute respiratory distress syndrome is when the lungs weaken, and this can be as if any part of COVID as a fatality or just the illness itself. The lungs weaken and are unable to keep fluids out. And there's kind of an internal drowning, whether it's just liquids, secretions, blood, bile, any type of fluid, the lungs just can't keep it out. They get weakened, and it's just not a good situation. So that's kind of the main areas of fatality of how this virus will affect people and eventually kill them. And again, just a brief chart again. If you're not running a fever, you can probably rule out flu and COVID right off the bat. Kind of an important thing to always remember is our vitals. If you do somebody's vitals and they're all normal, you can rule out about 1,000 different things that it isn't. If your temperature is normal, somewhere within 98.6, give or take a degree, even a degree and a half. If your breath runs about 20 breaths or 60 breaths a minute, depending on if you're exercising, that's normal. If your blood pressure is anywhere within the 120 to 80 range, depending on what your age is, and if the oxygen in your blood is normal, again, you can rule out about 1,000 different things. Oh yeah, and if your pulse is, you should be running, what should your pulse be running? I think it's 60 to 80 beats per minute. So there's the 4 main vitals. If you go into hospital, that's the first thing they check for. And if those are all normal, the doctor's like, well, what's wrong? We have to do, house MD to figure out what's up with you. So again, here's the main things. You can find this graph and several others easily just by running Google or anywhere. Things we don't know yet, the actual origins of where this came from. Was this a wet market bat meat, or was it procured in a laboratory? And I know that's pretty horrible stuff to hear, but let's face it, pretty much every sophisticated country in the world has biological warfare stacked away. It's just an ugly truth. It really is. And Iraq, Saddam Hussein liberally used toxic agents, killing the Kurds in northern Iraq, deliberately and purposefully. And you think about that, it's just horrible stuff. But the reality is we have these agents and they are locked away, but they could be released. And as a society, at least the human race, we're not much to brag about sometimes, but we try to really move away from that. It's a real taboo. Not that shooting anybody is any really different or bombing them, but we've tried to move away from the idea of biological warfare, because once it's released, we have no control over it. We have no control, no leverage, no measured response to it. It's an animal to itself. And that's just really difficult. Many of you may have heard this already. It's on YouTube. You can look it up. There is a virologist. Her name is Li Ming Yan. She's an MD. She escaped Hong Kong about 8 weeks ago, right before China, the CCP, did a takeover. And Hong Kong has been trying to fight for independence, well, as long as Tibet has. And China, who is not world players, they're not friends. Really, I hate to say that. We're living in 2020, and you're trying to be a progressive, in a way, planet. And here we still have these guys who are totally shut down, secretive. They don't share. They're not friends of the earth in a lot of ways. And it makes you wonder. It's like, get with the program type thing. But she came out blatantly. I think it was Tucker Carlson, and you can see it on YouTube, and said not only was it procured in a lab, but it was deliberately released. And that's a really horrible thought, but it's out there. And I'm not advocating did it happen. Is she a whistleblower? Is she a tool? I don't know, but you can check YouTube out. You can see her. You can decide for yourself if you believe her or not. Which medications work? We don't really know that for sure. Usually for trial medications, we're talking years. And doing a trial medication at 3 months or 6 months, all we can do is have preliminary, does it work? It's not really long enough. However, if it was our life on the line, you can bet we'd race, to give it a shot. So there's 3 levels of it. And that's first antivirals. And that's, of course, hydrochloroquine, which has been beaten up back and forth. Yet you guys have all heard the research on it. It's used liberally in Africa, who's seeing a very low, probably one of the lowest rates of COVID anywhere in the world, believe it or not. And they liberally hand out hydrochloroquine. And the media doesn't really admit to that very much. Remdesivir, which Anthony Fauci is really big on, and I would be too if I owned the amount of stock in remdesivir that he does. Dexamethasone, which I think is what Trump said he took. I know that Amy Klobuchar's husband took hydrochloroquine, and she came out immediately a week after he took it. And this too is on the internet saying it saved his life. And they shut that down pretty quick. So you make your own assumptions, folks. So there's the antivirals, then there's anti-inflammatory. And if you remember, we talked about cytokines and how our own immune system will race in there to do what it does. Well, sometimes there's other anti-inflammatory medicines that can be given to offset that, to offset that cytokine release. And then there's immunology or immune-based therapies. So there's 3 lines of it, and they're doing research on all of them right now as quickly as they can. And you all probably seen in the news that China and Russia reportedly already using their own vaccine. We don't know too much about it. Given China's culpability in this pandemic, I'm not sure how much I would race over there to have that vaccine. I don't know. More will be revealed. One silver lining is pharmaceutical companies in multiple countries are working together to come up with a vaccine. Some are privately owned. Many of these pharmaceutical companies are conglomerates and they work together, and that's what we need to be doing 100%. And just a couple others on what we don't know yet. If individuals who are asymptomatic with COVID can become symptomatic at some point, and if health factors play a role, pre-existing conditions, substance abuse, things like that. So if you're asymptomatic, can you kind of come out of remission or not having symptoms and go into it? Not sure on that one. And if individuals who are asymptomatic with COVID build up antibodies, convalescent plasma, and are immune to future infections from COVID. And that'll be something that only future research and a number of other items will be able to tell us. And again, in general, with different strains of influenza, at any given time, 33% of people who get infected are simply asymptomatic. It just doesn't affect them. And that is, of course, you guys, because most influenzas don't bind with our DNA or our RNA at a really high percentage point. Some bind at 20%, some at 40, 42, 61. But COVID binds with it. I'm hearing numbers upwards of 100%, which means there's something mechanical in there. So here's just some of the stuff coming out just to take a look at. COVID-related social isolation. And by the way, next month, I'll really hit on mental health. They're still really pulling data. And by next month and thereafter, we'll have better numbers on this, on the mental health aspect of it. But it's going to be profound, that is for sure. So COVID-related social isolation and stress can increase susceptibility to substance use, misuse, and abuse. And again, if you guys want good research, almost any state university or university of that has a hospital or a medical school associated with it, they have great data. You know, many of the UC schools have it, Harvard, Princeton, Notre Dame, Johns Hopkins, George Washington. I have kids over there going to school. If you go to any of their websites, they often have some of the very best research, and you can pretty much trust what you're seeing from them. Quarantine and COVID-19 have caused many people in recovery to relapse due to fear and stress. And I was talking with some of you guys before we started today, and all of us are experiencing some of this stress by now. Substance use can lead to immune system, respiratory, and pulmonary changes, and may increase susceptibility to COVID-19 complications as well. That's an understatement. If you're using drugs, out drinking, and especially smoking, if you're a younger person, your chances of getting it, you may be asymptomatic, but your chances of getting it go up proportionally. There's just no doubt about it. And I won't even bother going to all the sources that concur that information, but every major group that I would look at, WebMD, Medscape, again, Johns Hopkins, George Washington, University of Washington, all of them have just through the roof agree with it. Even mild and moderate alcohol use, smoking or vaping, any drug can weaken the immune system, not just chronic and addictive use. A lot of people love to, minimize by saying, well, I just do it a little bit. Well, a little bit at a time like this is not even a good thing, to be honest with you. Alcohol and drugs relax people and cause people to be less aware, cautious, mindful, and when it comes to infection control. And again, this is why they're busting all those kid parties and large gatherings in the first month, 2 months, 3 months. People were ignoring it, and clearly that was the cause of outbreaks. Again, I'm just going to do one slide real quick on mental health aspects, and I'll be really emphasizing this in a month when we do another presentation. And it'll be all about mental health statistics, who gets affected, and most important, what to do about it. Job loss and unemployment due to COVID, increased anxiety disorders and affective disorders. And affective disorders are all the depressions, bipolar, dysthymia, things like that. Increase in stress due to financial hardship, debt, and crisis management. Access to physicians and hospitals. We're overwhelmed due to COVID, making it difficult to get treatment in a timely manner. And that was just people who had ongoing pre-existing conditions that needed treatment without COVID. Then COVID hits, and then bang, everything gets compounded. And then another thing that we saw, which was heartbreaking, I think through a number of different stories, there was restrictions to access to medical and treatment services increased due to COVID. Family members not being able to go in to see loved ones in the hospital. I know Aloha House did total shutdown, which they should have, but people needed to get in and see and get services. And this is where our system gets overloaded and we become less effective and even non-effective. And again, and as I go into some numbers here in a second, we had an increase in all forms of substance abuse and behavioral disorders. And again, largely in younger people with a little bit of age and wisdom were more careful, cautious, more predictable that they were going to make better decisions, where younger people who lack experience, knowledge, and impulse control did not at all. They just saw this as a great inconvenience to their freedom. Okay, so just the normal drinking patterns, which is considered by the FDA as being acceptable, is 1 drink per day for women and 1 to 2 drinks per day for men. The following are referenced beverages that are 1 alcoholic drink, 12 fluid ounces of regular beer, 5% alcohol, 5 fluid ounces of wine, 12% alcohol, or a very small amount, 1.5 ounces of 80 proof distilled, and that's 40% alcohol. So if it's 100 proof, it is 50% alcohol. 120 and Everclear, you're talking almost pure alcohol, and that gets lethal. So you shouldn't be drinking that at all. The total calories in a beverage may be more than those from alcohol alone, depending on the type, brand, ingredients, and portion size. For example, 12 ounces of regular beer, 5% alcohol, may have about 150 calories. 5 ounces of wine, 12% alcohol, may have about 120, and 7 ounces of rum, 40% alcohol, and cola may have about 155 calories. These numbers are very modest. Some beverages with alcohol in it are 200, 225, 250 calories a drink. And so 2 or 3 drinks and you're taking in almost half of your caloric intake for a day, and you haven't even eaten yet. So this is why alcohol can be so incredibly fattening. And the reason I just wanted to go over real briefly FDA's normal drinking is this is not a time really to be drinking at all because of, 1, what it does to the immune system. 2, it leaves people open for infection problems with COVID because of impulse control and making bad decisions. 3, alcohol always leaves somebody feeling depressed the next day because try to keep it a very bare minimum. And again, in comparison to moderate alcohol consumption, high-risk drinking is a consumption of 4 or more drinks a day, or 8 or more drinks per week for women, or 5 or more drinks a day, or 15 drinks or more per week for men. And binge drinking is consumption within 2 hours of 4 or more drinks for women, or 5 or more drinks for men. If people are drinking on that level, even if there isn't a quarantine or a bad virus going on, it's just unbelievably unhealthy for you. And it certainly meets criteria for pushing for alcoholism.
Sean, could you please share your screen, please? Excuse me.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can do this now. Okay.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So what I'm going to do is drop down. Okay. So I'm just going to whip through these since we already hit on those. Get down to the bottom one. And again, when we're looking at excessive drinking, is responsible for 88,000 loss of lives a year just from drinking alone. That's not including accidents, death by misadventure, things like that, or its contribution to suicide. And its costs are just literally tragic when it comes down to it. So, so again, the point of this is looking at how people, what problematic drinking looks like, and what excessive drinking is, and the reasons not to be doing it. And then I'm going to show you how much more people have been doing it in quarantine, which is exactly what we don't want to see happen. Remember, when this thing is done, hopefully sometime at the end of this year, early next year, one of these medication therapies or a vaccine is created, we're going to be cleaning up the mess. And that's probably the greater concern, is like, how long will it take us to be caught up on some of this stuff? It's like we're skipping classes, if you will, and we're nearing the end of the final, and it's literally that type of an arrangement. It's very problematic. And again, just drinking alone is associated with just about every health problem that there is: heart disease, obesity, depression, suicide, accidents, you name it. So the point here is, anytime we're in an emergency macro event, we should not be doing heavy drinking, heavy drug taking. If in fact, we should be doing just the opposite, to keep our senses and our wits and our health about us. So we good? You guys got my screen?
Yes, thank you.
All right, good. So just here's some of the statistics. Nielsen came out with some of the best stuff, I think, of everything that I saw and have been reviewing. March 2019 compared to March 2020 saw a 54% increase in alcohol sales. Boom, move it over to the next month. Online sales of alcohol increased by 500% in late April. These are staggering numbers. Now, let me qualify this. Some people believe that this was people stockpiling, which makes sense. Alcoholics, drug addicts, when you get into a stress situation, which everybody felt when the world came to a stop on March 15th, had to secure their supply. Just like all the people in high stress ran out and bought all the toilet paper. It didn't make a lot of sense, but for some reason, toilet paper was a high commodity, and water and bleach, understandably, but toilet paper, I don't know. But a lot of this was stockpiling, people not being afraid that they couldn't keep their supply up. And then when they saw the continuation of this, they realized it wasn't stockpiling. People were just really getting hammered, trying to deny the situation, if you will. Again, University of Michigan found that between 98 and 2006, I report this study a lot because I think it's so important. It's just incredibly important. Between 98 and 2006, death by cirrhosis doubled and then doubled again in 2008, right around the time of the housing market recession, which was wasn't a pandemic, but it certainly was a crisis, to 2016 among white, Hispanic, Native American males, aged 24 to 34 years old. And why is this important? Well, these guys, starting at probably age 20, they were drinking really high. Asians and South Pacific Islanders were in the lower range of cirrhosis death compared to white, Hispanic, Native Americans, and African Americans. So, but that's a staggering statistic. And it means if you see young men in this age group who are drinking, you really want to be redirecting them and be like, look, slow down. You need to realize you're putting yourself in a very, for some reason, high category right now by doing some of the excessive intake that I just mentioned, that binge drinking. And for the males, you can bet binge drinking led to their cirrhotic condition. There's no doubt about it. Usually we saw people with cirrhosis of the liver who were much older, 50 and 60 and 70 years old, who'd been drinking their whole life and then picked up midlife or toward retirement when they were older. These younger guys, they're hitting it hard, doing binge drinking patterns. And 15 drinks a week. I know kids that do 60 drinks a week, and I'm all over them about consequences they're lining up to face. Along with the memes that came out, you may have seen some of these. Social media tried to make light of it, give some brevity to the situation. And an ongoing joke about quarantinis to account for and make acceptable binge drinking, whether alone or in small or large groups of people. And social media exploded with memes on substance abuse and addiction, reflecting the impact of quarantine due to COVID. And of course, with people stockpiling food, they had memes coming out that people going to their house were really slender and in good shape, and then 5 months later coming out and having obesity problems. And we were laughing about it then, but some of us might have gained a few pounds in the past few months. And then again, just to top it off, the medical and psychological impact of excessive alcohol intake. And again, those numbers are available to you at NIDA and CDC on binge drinking, and FDA has them up too. Again, alcohol is associated and highly correlated with just about every mental health and psychological and behavioral impact that there can be. Anxiety, depression, weight gain, lower productivity, sleep disorders, which again, remember in our sleep, what do? We reboot our system. We get rid of free radicals. We build up our immunology. We build up our brain in our sleep. And if you're not getting good restful sleep that's not alcohol induced, then your body's less effective the next day and the next day. And this came from, of course, wonderful American Heart Association, and their data is always good as well. Excessive drinking can increase the risk for liver disease, obesity, breast cancer, all of the rest of it, high blood pressure, atrial fibrillation, and stroke and heart attack. And then for people who are taking prescription drugs, not necessarily painkillers or sedatives, but just in general, statin drugs are finding alcohol is not a good combination with, or excessive alcohol, and blood pressure medications. And blood pressure we've known for quite a while, but statin drugs is kind of something new. So, and again, down to the effects on brain function, such as memory, balance, rational thinking. These are so important in stopping the spread of this condition. When they did open up some of the bars in San Diego, I was going around looking around the city, and they were not doing a lot of physical distancing. And then the state came in and shut them down again, which was right. They should have done that. And that just leads everybody to high risk. And again, with the threat of COVID, people have been drinking more. We've seen higher alcohol sales, which has continued. Costco's reporting huge, larger than number sales of alcohol. One of the problems in California is so many businesses, as a matter of fact, all businesses for the most part were shut down. Restaurants did takeout, but they kept bottle shops open, tobacco stores open. I have some of the figures on that. Online stores for alcohol and sales went through the ceiling. I mean, just stuff. It just increased, and they didn't shut those down. They called those necessary businesses. And well, I largely disagree with that. There's probably a time when shutting those things down would have been a good idea. So the increased anxiety and stress, which is often coupled with depression, always comes if someone's meeting criteria for alcoholism. And again, people are already socially distanced. This has only been impacted more. Jeannie offered just some really great insights on how it's been in Hawaii, just people very socially distanced and not having a lot of conversations with friends and being upfront. It's important that we're doing that. And again, I'll be talking in the next month about the need for social distancing and when it's going just overboard and how we need to kind of compensate for that. For some people in rural areas who lack funding, drastically reduced access to alcohol, which may lead to alcohol withdrawal. That was one of the main things that came up. How will people who have addictions be okay? How will they access treatment? And we're going to see probably not good data in January, February, March about people who are not able to access what they needed. And when I get into drugs, you'll see some of the problems that have already been born from that. 23% of drinkers smoke or vape. So they're doubling down. Just looking at the drugs, in 2013, they really put the crack down on opiate prescriptions. And I think I came out and talked to you guys on opiates before, but every decade has a drug. Through a depressed decade from the late 90s through 2010, it was all about opiates. And I won't digress too much into that now, but as a result, they finally put a crackdown on opiate prescriptions. But still, we had almost the same amount of opiate overdoses and deaths in 2019, 72,000. It was down just very little from the year before. And the reason is because people just went out and got drugs elsewhere. And again, Medscape, great material on Medscape. If you guys have any questions about medical care studies, they're just loaded with good stuff. And they're in several branches. This comes from Medscape Neurology. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said that indicate the following regarding the period beginning 2015 to the end of 2019. Even though they did this crackdown on the opiates, people just got their drugs from somewhere else, involving illicitly manufactured fentanyl and fentanyl analogs increased from 5,700 to 36,000 deaths. Involving stimulants increased from 4,400 to 16,000. Again, every decade has a drug. We've just gone into stimulant abuse because prior to COVID, the economy was stable. We weren't at war. People have more disposable income. They go for drugs that make them feel better. So sure enough, methamphetamine, MDMA, cocaine have flooded the streets. They're all over the place. And the overdose statistics reflect that. So they couldn't get prescription drugs or a great reduction in those, and people just found drugs in other places. And again, almost everything increased. And the reason I'm putting these up there is already this year, 6 months into the pandemic, the numbers are way above what you're seeing right now. And that's why I said in February, March, I'll have real numbers for you. But all the statistics that I'm seeing from different corner reports, preliminary data, are all suggesting that these numbers are going to be high. And of course, it's going to be reflected by COVID. And again, treatment centers for both mental health and substance abuse, they're all full right now. And they're slow to discharge people, and then taking someone new in, they got to quarantine, have the whole protocols and everything else. So it's challenging. Let's see. How have we responded to the drugs? Well, over 40 states have reported increases in opiate-related mortality and concerns and increased mental illness or substance use disorder. And that was from the American Medical Association task force just this month. And so what did they do? As a result, the AMA and SAMHSA have provided increased flexibility to access buprenorphine, also known as Suboxone, and methadone to patients with opiate addiction. So here's the problem. Stop, let's just think for a minute. Here we've got this pandemic, okay? And within the pandemic, we have a surge in drug abuse. And the only thing we can do to moderate it is giving people drugs like buprenorphine and methadone. So what we're doing is we're kicking the can down the street. And this may not seem like a lot, but we're going to have the onset of new addictions from COVID, people who've never abused drugs or didn't meet criteria for addiction, and then the people who relapsed back into addiction, and then people who were already addicted but went back or had increased amounts of buprenorphine or methadone. So whenever the smoke clears, we're going to have a great need for a lot of addiction services and mental health services in 2021. And we're going to need to get very creative to meet the demands. I had a young man in the office the other day, just to meet him once, and he's only 28. His parents have disowned him after years of heroin addiction. He's with his aunt and his uncle here in San Diego. And he came in, he was so sick. He was one of the sickest kids I've seen all year. Staph infection, diabetes out of control. Just got out of the hospital, is not following protocols. It is so sad to see somebody come in that is that close to losing their life. And one is a kind of a death of despair. And I think that he's just lost all drive to live. And COVID hasn't helped that at all. And again, medical services are so stretched out that they can't really attend to a guy like this. And so I'm just working with the family and the best we can do to find somewhere to get him into. So again, on top of that, the SAMHSA and the new DEA rules and guidance in full for the duration of the national emergency And this is including flexibility for evaluation and prescribing requirements using telemedicine. So again, this is problematic stuff. We're making it accessible for people to get these drugs, but we're kicking the can down the street. And then there's support, the removal of prior authorization, step therapy, or other administrative barriers for medications used to treat opiate disorder. Meaningful enforcement, mental health and substance use disorder parity laws is long overdue. So again, we're going to learn a lot of stuff at the end of this. And they've also loosened the prescription, writing for opiates. They've kind of opened up the floodgates on that. And they're allowing more of it out there. The sterile needle and syringe exchange programs, I support that as far as harm reduction. And we don't need a pandemic within a pandemic within a pandemic. So let's get on to a couple other things. Again, the impact just I'm seeing in California and from my other friends around the country, getting them into treatment is very, very difficult right now because everything is filled up. They almost have waiting lists to get into hospitals. I have a couple of bipolar patients, and I'll be getting them, unfortunately, handcuffed to a bed in a hospital room somewhere because I have to put them somewhere safe prior to getting them into the next available psychiatric hospital. And this came from the NCBI, another great source of research. Substance use disorder patients are at a much higher risk for contamination due to multiple factors attributable to whatever their clinical, psychosocial, and psychological and financial conditions are. Remember, macro event, micro event, and depending on who you are and what you have going on, quarantine and a pandemic is going to really complicate that. Immigrants and lower socioeconomic SUD patients are compounded simply due to their legal and financial standing. And again, I'll get into some of that next month when we talk about mental health figures. Social and economic changes caused by the pandemic, along with the traditional difficulties regarding treatment access and adherence, will certainly worsen during this period, therefore aggravate people's conditions. There will be silver linings. We'll learn stuff that we need to know if and when this happens again. The population are potential vectors of transmission of COVID and other medical conditions. It's just so important to know that. I told the aunt and the uncle's a really well-known doctor, and I'm like, look, you need to quarantine this guy. He's going out, he's using drugs, he's coming back, he's not really spending time at their house, but they're putting him up in a motel. But they love him, but it's like, I'm like, you need to really have infection control when you get around him. He could be asymptomatic or he could be symptomatic. If he got COVID, he would be in one of the higher risk groups for mortality. Specific strategies for prevention and treatment need to be developed by health professionals dealing with SUD, and know what their limitations are and what they can do and what they can't do. And this is a good time for all of us to be talking to our program friends, to other clinicians, really doing supervision with each other. And, all the hospital beds the Army set up in different places in continental US, in hindsight, we should have left some of those up. We should have left some emergency centers up for people like this kid, with a multitude of problems, and we can't keep him in a hospital bed. So we should have really left some of those places standing for the overflow of patients that would have come 3 months, 6 months, and perhaps 9 months into this. And again, with addiction, it must be reinforced instead of postponed in order to avoid complications of both COVID and SUD, and to prevent transmission if these people are infected. All the meetings, 12-step, smart recovery, came to a grinding halt really over the past 6 months. They're slowly being reinstated outdoors and in some recreational centers, and not at all at churches. Uh, you guys, how are you guys doing with AA meetings over there and NA meetings? Are you guys holding them? Are they all online? What do you got going? Anybody know what Aloha House is doing, or if they have meetings at the beach? I know I've seen meetings down in at the different parks at the beaches. Well, all I can say is I hope that they're going on. I suppose I can put a call over to the Lahaina Alano Club and see what they're doing. But by all means, they should be putting meetings on and trying to connect people to support and resource. Some treatment centers did a total lockdown, especially after what happened with nursing homes in New York City, which was incredibly irresponsible. Again, we're going to learn in hindsight what happened, what shouldn't have happened, what liabilities and responsibilities go where. But treatment centers put a stop on admitting people. And again, when people need treatment for addictions, it really just doesn't wait. I was speaking to Jeannie and Joyce when we started. There's been a lot of grant money released, and if whoever is in charge over there needs to apply for some of this grant money, they've put $110 million plus out for substance abuse treatment as part of the relief fund, which was absolutely necessary for including alcoholism treatment, mental health treatment, and suicide prevention. 40 million, that could have been doubled, and it still would have not been enough. But at least they put this out there, and hopefully we'll get another relief package before too long. And again, this money just needs to be applied for, and Hawaii of all places is really top of the list to be able to get some of that. And then again, smoking in general, and I've already hit on this, smoking is such a horrible health problem. Vaping cannabis, all the syrups we talked about that are street syrups back in April. It is probably the worst coexisting condition with a disease like this that you can have. If you see someone smoking, stay away from them. Seriously, it's like there's just a high likelihood that they could be, infected, asymptomatic, or infected and just not as sick as they're possibly going to be. Cigarette sales increased 1.1% through the week of March 22nd. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a lot. That's like huge. Listings on Yelp for online tobacco sales increased 120% in the month of March into the month of April, and that's continued. So they are selling tons of cigarettes, both online and at all the tobacco shops are open. Tobacco and vaping industries offered freebies of masks and gloves if you bought certain quantities of their product. Just a gross, I don't even know what you call it, just a really kind of a gross manipulation and tying people in. If you remember in the first month or two, there were no masks. We had a big weight on masks and gloves and disinfectants. And so tobacco companies bought up as much as they could. And if you come in and buy cigarettes, hey, we'll give you a health product too. Somehow associating smoking with some kind of a safety catch to it, which is just really poor pairing. And in California and many other states, in the initial 60 to 90 days of quarantine, liquor and tobacco stores, as well as cannabis dispensaries, were considered essential businesses. I've been in, since COVID started, probably 3, maybe even 4 times to one of the cannabis stores closest to where I live in San Diego. And of the 3 times I've been down, I think I only went in once fully into the store, because the line was around the block. People went in, and again, it was stockpiling. Some of these cigarette sales were probably people stockpiling. People do really bad things based out of fear, based out of stress, based out of panic. And people with addictions are probably at the top of that list, and they have to make sure they have a supply. In California, since they've taxed it to sell it and taxed it to buy it, actually illicit sales of cannabis, or not state regulated sales of cannabis, have tripled, because people are like, why should I be bothered buy it in a dispensary, or they're charging me like crazy when I can get it for half price from the guy down the street. But again, the fact that they left these places open as essential business is just negligent, to say the least. Of younger people who suffered severe illness as a result of COVID, many were users of tobacco, vape syrup, or cannabis. Due to flavored vape juice with nicotine, high schoolers increased their rate of use 3.6 million to 5.6 million in just 1 year, 2019 to 2020. And why is this important? Well, these are newly addicted vape customers. These are newly, or fawning addictive clients, or customers rather. So what does that mean? Well, now we've got all these kids, 3.6 to 5.6, going into a pandemic with a new problem. And so again, you have to think about that. Here, these are the outlying problems that we're going to see 3 months, 6 months, a year from now. Is it's all increased. A year ago, the promotion of this vaping and the ongoing promotion of vaping, vape juices, cannabis sales has increased, and then boom, we have a pandemic, and now everything gets compounded. According to Truth Initiative, another great online research group, 1 in 4 high schoolers use flavored nicotine vape. Altria, the maker of Marlboro cigarettes, say due to stimulus checks and e-cigarette restrictions, that's actually driven up the sales of traditional Marlboro cigarettes. So when people got stimulus checks or welfare checks, of course, they can't buy alcohol, they can't buy certain vape pens and certain syrups. But guess what? They could buy traditional tobacco. Talk about a double standard, and also adding insult to injury. It's just all wrong. And we need to really look at that in the future if this comes up again. And again, another just a little side note, in addition to, since people are spending less on travel, entertainment, movies, dining out, they have more time to light up at home. Interventions and alternatives. And this is just some of the things that we absolutely need to think about. Simple things. I say this every day to almost every client I see. Sleep, diet, exercise. Absolutely the most important things to our physical health that we can do. Next thing, abstain. There's kind of a time and place for everything. I won't get into ecclesiastics, but this is probably the worst time for people to imbibe in any type of substance abuse. We need to keep our wits and our impulses and our serious mindedness and our funds, in the right place. For those with SUD, gain support from friends, family, peers, other people in recovery. Stay connected. Respect social distancing and infection control, but spend real-time activities with families and friends. Again, if people aren't showing symptomology, there's probably a really good chance that they're not infected, they're not running a fever. Oh, by the way, the sales for thermometers and temperature gaugers, wow, that would have been a good business to have stock in right away. Everybody bought those. If they're not showing bad vitals, any of the 4 vitals that I talked about, chances are they don't have it. Get with friends, have food, talk story, spend some quality time with people. And, we need to do this, and we can still practice safety control and social distancing, but still be with people. And we need that for our mental health. Access care for providers, either in person or online. And there's numerous hotlines for relapse prevention and addiction recovery support. I can give you a list, and many of them are just online right away. Just Google Hawaii relapse prevention. And it doesn't even have to be in Hawaii. It can be anywhere in the country. There's people on standby that are getting subsidized through relief money for that. Okay, coming to the end here. My old buddy, Sigmund Freud. Thinking, why am I putting Freud up here? There he is about 1909, just after he got back, 1910, right when he got back from his big trip to America to visit Clark University for their 20th anniversary. And there he is in the last year and a half, 2 years of his life. And you can see him holding his beloved hand-rolled Viennese cigar, and he loved them. He loved them so much, he smoked almost 20 of those a day. Here's another picture. Wonderful, amazing, fantastic Eddie Van Halen, who in the late 70s took his guitar, and most of us with him, and showed us things that we just didn't know could be done on the guitar. You're probably thinking, why am I putting these two guys on the same page? You're like, why would these two people be associated? Well, they have a lot in common, you know? And again, it comes down to respiratory illness. Van Halen's grandparents and his parents were from the Netherlands. Freud lived in Vienna for his entire life, until 1938, when Nazi Gauleiter Arthur Seyss-Inquart took over Vienna or Austria, and he had to be an evacuee to London, where he lived out the last year of his life, wrote his last book, and died in 1939. The Van Halens came to the U.S. in the early 60s. But what did these guys have in common? Both of them were incredibly addicted to stimulant drugs. Both Van Halen and Freud were addicted to cocaine. Van Halen was addicted to alcohol as well, and both of them were profound nicotine addicts. Freud smoked up to 20 of those cigars a day. He had, between 1918 and his death in Marisville Gardens in 1939, he'd had over 30 surgeries of the mouth. And this is back when it was not a pretty picture. He had infections, and he had this awful apparatus that was in his mouth, which had to be taken out 4 or 5 times a day and cleaned. It smelled terrible. And they just did one surgery after another on him, until finally his doctor who was attending to him in London, was coming in to do treatment again with him. And he said, no, it's time. He was 86, and the doctor gave him a lethal injection of morphine, and it was death by physician-assisted suicide. Eddie Van Halen was a 2 to 4 pack a day cigarette smoker. There's not too many pictures where you'll see him where he doesn't have a cigarette in his mouth. He had cancer starting in the early 90s. He had a good portion of his tongue removed. I think I mentioned I have a brother that works in the film industry, and I've worked in the music industry, and I know people. And one of my friends called me up and told me that in January, Eddie had gone to Berlin to one of their best clinics for oral and throat and esophageal cancer, and called me and said he's probably not going to live the year out. And by this time it had spread. He actually was in remission from cancer, or considered remission clean, in the early 2000s, and began smoking again, if you can believe it. And you got to talk about a powerful addiction. Well, I covered it in April when we talked. You have to think about that, the fact that somebody would smoke a product or take a product until it kills them. It's insane by any standards that you can think of. So both had profound addiction to cocaine and profound addiction to nicotine and tobacco. Van Halen was vaping in between smoking regular cigarettes. And again, eventually it killed him just last week. And not a big surprise to a lot of people, but nonetheless, a huge loss. And most importantly, an unnecessary one. And again, you don't expect to see these two people with, you know, so far distanced in time and the type of work they did, but they were both innovators. They were both just magnetic thinkers in many ways. They had profound abilities, and they also had profound curses. I guess my favorite saying, or the book I might write, will be called "Everyone Has Their Kryptonite," you know? So with that, I'm open to any questions and any ideas or thoughts anybody might have. I see Jeannie looking into the camera there a little deeper. Turn up my mic here a little bit. I will ask you guys, is it as hot over there right now as it is here in San Diego? We're at about 95 degrees today. It's pretty amazing. Okay.
It's hot.
It's hot.
696.
Okay. Well, we're in the same thermocline over here. So, well, you guys, any questions or afterthoughts?
I had a question. This is Diane. I thought that I'd heard somewhere that the COVID-19 was morphing into other types of infections, other types of viruses. Is that true?
Curious, where did you hear that? I'd love to go research that.
I have no idea. I listen to everything.
Well, you know, that will be very big news, and it would probably, if that is true, and they've been looking for that. I didn't find any information on that, but I'm a one day at a time kind of guy, and that might have come out before in the last week. So far, they know it spreads. They don't believe it spreads from human to animal, but it definitely came from animal to human in some form. But if it mutates, that'll be something, that'll be a very significant thing.
Yeah, I have to remember where I heard that. I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah,
that kind of scared me.
Yeah, well, it would scare all of us without it.
Yeah.
I would just say to that is, if you find that, please call me or send me an email.
I will.
Anything else, Jeannie, Brian, anybody else in the chat?
Well, isn't that what the issue with the virus is, that it mutates all the time? I mean, it can even come into our own system and mutate. Isn't that one of
all viruses, from my knowledge, have the potential to do that. But here's the thing: we already know that, you know, if you get COVID, you can be asymptomatic, and if you get it even at an advanced age, you're still at a very, very low percentage to die from it. From when the inception was sometime in December or January this year, you got to remember, you guys, this virus has gone through millions and millions of people's immunology. Every single person that virus has gone through, that person's immunology is beat up. It's mutated in that way. It's that herd inoculation, or that herd immunity. When it travels over time through all these people, different respiratory systems, and they beat it up, and it becomes less than it was before. It mutates in a downward spiral. Like if you have a family of kids, you know, the first one gets the flu really sick. Then the second one catches it moderately sick. Third one gets it. Can I go out, mom and dad? You know, it's already run its course just in the family system. So that much we do know, but if it's mutating in a negative direction, you know, causing greater illnesses, then that's going to be a problem. And that being said, let me just say this. The ability for even a worse disease to come from a virus is very possible. When you get somebody seriously as sick as the guy that I saw in the office today, or I'm sorry, not today, but a few days ago, Friday, staph infection, diabetes. I don't know that he has COVID, but he's at the highest risk. Methadone, doing pills, smoking. Think about what's going on in his system. He's just a walking petri dish. That's what we have to worry about. It's when you get that mix of a 5 different things going wrong in someone's body that has the potential to be the next AIDS or something like that. That's where just something unbelievably bad can come from. Now that is a risk. And so when you get combination disorders going at once, combination medical problems, that's where all of a sudden something really bad can come from that. So we need to be thinking on that, absolutely. So, but if you find info, I'd love to see it.
Well, thank you, Sean. We really appreciate your time with us today, and we shall see you again in November.
Okay, you guys have a good rest of the day. It was nice to be here with you.